Free to learn.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Bergstrom. Thank you for joining us for our third and final program in our Back to Business series, this one entitled Keeping Up with the Digital Revolution. I'm John Bergstrom. I'm the president of the chapter in Minnesota, the NACD Minnesota chapter, and we're pleased to present this program in conjunction with the NACD Capital Area chapter today. As I think most of you know, NACD is now a membership organization with over 21,000 members nationally, and our two chapters are two of 20 of those chapters in the United States that serve our geographies. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping details. As many of you know from attending past NACD events, surveys are very important to us after the event. And since we've moved to virtual events, this information is even more valuable as we learn to adjust to do things right and bring people together, including things like a joint program like this, which we're excited to do. A link will be provided in the chat box prior to the end of the program, as well as in a follow-up email. And we would hope you could take the time to complete the survey. Thank you very much. Our sponsors are important to each of us. In the Minnesota chapter, we're pleased to have sponsors including Clifton Larson Allen, Frederickson and Byron, Grant Thornton, KPMG, and Protiviti. Representatives of several of those, if not all of those firms, are with us today. We also have several of our board members with us today. You can see on the screen the list of our current board members in the Minnesota chapter. We'd also like to welcome our full board and NAC governance and board leadership fellows in attendance. You can see the names of our full board members on screen now. And before I turn this over to Maria Clark from the Capital Area chapter, I just want to share three programs that we have upcoming, programs or roundtables upcoming for our Minnesota chapter. You can see them on screen and you can see them on our website. ESG Evolution has an April 27th date. Supply chain challenges and international growth in the new political era will have dates to be announced. Please check our website for that. Maria?
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maria Clark, NACD Capital Area Advisory Board member, and we're thrilled to see all of you today. First, I'd like to recognize the NACD Capital Area sponsors. As always, we couldn't do what we do without you. Thank you for all you do to support us. I'd also like to thank my fellow advisory board members for their work and support of NACD members in the capital area. For those of you with us today who are an NACD fellow or NACD certified, you will receive credit today for attending the program. If you haven't registered to get NACD certified, consider evaluating this credential to enhance your board profile and sharpen your director's skills. You can express your interest in learning more about certification when you receive your survey following the program. I also want to add, feel free to reach out to me directly as I have gone through the program. Now let's get this started. As we look to the future of digital in our ever-evolving business world, directors must ask themselves a critical question. How is my board preparing for the digital revolution? I'm delighted to introduce our fireside chat speakers today, Dr. Cynthia Arnold and Ryan McManus, as they share their expertise and perspective around keeping up with the digital revolution. Dr. Cynthia Arnold has over 30 years experience leading technology strategy, development, and commercialization of diverse industrial products and services. She most recently served as the Senior Vice President, Global Technology at Sherwin-Williams and Chief Technology Officer of the Valspar Corporation. Cynthia currently serves on the boards of the Cabot Corporation, Mulliken & Company, Citrine Informatics, and Aventium. Her committee service covers audit, finance, nomination and governance, ESG, and technology industrialization. She serves on the advisory board of the University of Minnesota Department of Chemical Engineering and Materials Science and the Office of Technology Commercialization. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Welcome. Ryan McManus is the founder and CEO of Tectonic, an advisory and software platform company that guides organizations through digital transformation to become digital and data leaders and generate business results. He has more than 25 years of leadership and execution across digital transformation, venture capital, corporate strategy, global operations, startups, and corporate boards. Ryan is the author of numerous articles on digital transformation and corporate strategy, and has served as an advisor to Fortune 500 companies, technology startups, and nonprofits. He is a member of the board of directors of Nortech Systems, where he chairs the nominating and governance committee and the science and technology committee. He's also on the advisory board of Car Labs AI and serves on the board of the Nacd New York chapter. Ryan has previously served on 2 advisory boards with the Aspen Institute. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Maria. Delighted to be here.
Now it's time to hear from our very esteemed speakers. Cynthia and Ryan, take it away.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you very much again, and a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm delighted to be participating in the fireside chat with Cynthia, and we're looking forward to the discussion and the deep dives at the end of our short conversation here as well. And so when we were planning out the topics for today, what we thought we would really want to do is share some of the experiences that we've had, of course, as board directors, but also as executives, investors, founders, in some cases, researchers into the topic, and really help to demystify what is, of course, a very urgent and pressing consideration. Trillions of dollars going into investment in this space, determining winners and losers across sectors and all the rest, but also is turning out to be somewhat challenging for a lot of organizations. So what we'd like to do, first of all, is set the context, share with you some of our views on what the critical foundational definitions and concepts are to get right. We'll talk about why this is challenging, why this is hard for some organizations, and then we will transition into a discussion of new leadership capabilities, and then critically, of course, the role of the board and what boards can do, because boards are in a very important position to drive success in this area. So with no further ado, Cynthia, really delighted for our conversation today. And the first thing that we thought we would share with people is a couple of words on the current operating context, right? And so digital is not new. We've been dealing with this for 20, 25 years. However, we've also all been living in a certain kind of reality for the last 12 or so months, right, with COVID and the pandemic. And one thing we've heard a lot about is this idea that COVID has accelerated digital transformation. Right, Satya Nadella from Microsoft said, we've seen 2 years worth of digital transformation in 2 months. And so let's unpack that a little bit and understand what's really happening and what really is driving in digital through this current operating context. Cynthia?
You're absolutely right, Ryan, and glad to be here and continue the conversation. But COVID really has changed the working environment. I think we've felt in many ways the most significant changes. We've had a gut punch in terms of having a change in demand that was really, really dramatic. If you think back to March and April of last year, what companies were facing was a great unknown. And that's not a comfortable working environment for a lot of businesses that are used to very static, more standard, conventional, slow-paced management processes. So here we are in this new environment with a great deal of variability and a great deal of uncertainty going forward. So we're faced with a dramatic change in demand. So where we seek information about when will demand come back, when are our sales going to bounce back, that type of responsibility, we start asking about maybe there's new sources of information that we have to get, the speed we have to get it is much faster. Supply chains have taken a hit. In some cases, demand has gone up for certain products, but many cases demand has gone down and suppliers have not been able to meet the demand of their customers. So these integrated complex supply chains now have been disrupted and you're trying to deal with it. So your ecosystem of thinking about How do I respond? How do I get the materials, the supplies I need to continue my business, where business continuity is so important? Your ecosystem changes. You're not thinking of just your suppliers, you're thinking of their environment and their distributors and logistics challenges. So here we are having to think about a larger ecosystem that's affecting us. And then, of course, there's the issues of managing for the care of your people and remote work. There's managing for cash and understanding where that's going to come from. So the demands for data coming faster and having more unknowns, I think, have been what have really impacted us in this new COVID environment and set us up for thinking that we've got to do things differently. If you're not already in digital, and digitally oriented companies have done better in this environment, but if you're not already in digital, you have to think differently about going forward if this is going to be a large part of the standard operating procedure going forward.
And so what Cynthia has described is the cross-functional impact, right? The urgency at the beginning of COVID around supply chains, team management, remote work, and the rest, obviously sales and new sales channels. And that starts to illustrate really the scale of the impact and the consideration. I actually see a bit of a risk here as well, right? If organizations are anchoring digital transformation conversations in COVID, what I've seen is actually more of an automation response for what we're already doing, right? And so we have automated remote work. We have and driven that at scale very rapidly. We have added technology to existing processes and services and the rest. And all of that's very important, but it's not necessarily transformational. Right. And so one thing to keep in mind as we go forward, are we looking at this digital space? And in my view, this is a generational change, right? What we're really undergoing is the shift from the analog economy and the models and frameworks and leadership capabilities that worked in the analog economy into the digital economy, which is different, right? And so one thing to right away to set in terms of definitions is that automation and transformation are not the same thing. They're related, but they are different, and you need both, right? And the risk is, if we look at sort of COVID and remote work and supply chain as sort of standalone independent processes, we need to do that. We need the efficiency, we need the performance and the scale, but it's not necessarily the same thing as new value propositions, new business models, new economics, new ecosystems, as Cynthia said, right? Yeah. And that's what wins. Right? We need to automate, we need to do all of those sorts of things, but we also need to be asking the bigger questions in terms of competition, value propositions, and the rest. And so, Cynthia, with that said, what do you see the urgency around this topic for most organizations?
Well, I see the urgency, first of all, because a lot of this change in external environment is going to continue. I agree with you completely, Ryan, that you shouldn't be knee-jerking and saying, as a response to COVID, somehow I'm going to put digital tools in place. And I'm a little reluctant to use the word digital strategy, because I'd like to highlight that there's a digital roadmap, but digital transformation is 100% about growth of your business and really thinking about your business model and those opportunities. And so I think what's urgent is that the externalities have changed and the speed at which it's happening have changed remarkably. And I think that's what at least COVID has been a catalyst for us to start seeing, and maybe a little extra motivation to push us over in the decision making and realize that it's not going to happen somewhere in the future, that this is now and our future, and you've got to start transforming now. So this is about 100% about growth, but your environment has changed. Your competitors have likely changed. The speed at which they're operating has likely changed. The technology is available. You've watched it happen with the large, internet companies, the technology savvy companies, but it is you. It is now going to start impacting, everyone's environment, and it's all encompassing. So it is quite urgent that you start thinking about how are we going to go forward in the environment now that we recognize these changes.
And I think this idea of the combination or the integration of speed and scale is very important here, right? Very important here. And it's something, again, to keep a very explicit eye on. There is approximately $7.5 trillion that's going to be invested in digital transformation over the next handful of years. That's on top of the several trillion dollars that's already been put in place, some of which we're not seeing yet from a competitive perspective. Just to give one data point, there's approximately 8 billion connected devices in the world right now. By 2030, we're looking at 3x that, right? And this is the kind of scale that we can not be paying attention to, that suddenly comes online and we're kind of caught unawares or caught off guard. We've seen this in banking, where there are banks that used to deliver 5,000 loans per month. They put their digital capability in place, flipped the business model a little bit, made the loans more accessible, faster to procure, lower interest rates, and they're now doing what they used to do in a month in a day. That's the speed of disruption that we all need to be looking for in our sectors, and that's also illustrative of why automation and transformation are related but separate. We're not going to be disrupted by automation nearly as much as we might be by some of the scale and speed intersections that we see playing out in different sectors. And this drives, again, this broader strategic engagement, this broader higher level sort of strategy with a capital S, if you will, thinking around digital transformation and digital business models. And so, Cynthia, we talked about functional strategies. We've seen a lot of organizations and boards do very strong work in areas like cyber, perhaps onboarding digital directors. Are there any things that boards should know in terms of those types of tactical engagements with digital as well?
Well, I think, there's been a lot of focus and there's been tools and frameworks that have come out to deal with cybersecurity. I would be very warning to boards that that's really just the tip of the iceberg. And that's almost about, IT type of functions. And what you again got to go back is you have to start thinking about your whole business processes, your whole growth model. Ryan and I have been discussing this, and we recognize that despite what we paint here as the reasons for urgency, a lot of boards and management teams are aware of the need for change, but really haven't acted on it. So I think it's worth asking, why is this really hard, in its full picture view? Why is it hard to get your hands around new business models, to keep your eyes open on this new and broader external environment, to act with speed? And I think there's a lot of reasons in companies why this is hard, but a lot of it has to do with being locked into legacy processes and legacy structures and being used to a way of working that says, I've had long-term planning, I revisit my strategy once a year, maybe a quick sort of brush it off kind of update. We've got an ERM, an enterprise risk management process, and, it's very static and it's the same old risks. And, you've not done a deep dive refresh anymore. So you're locked in the past. And I think this is where the board has a responsibility and an opportunity to shake management out and start bringing up what these externalities are, what the reasons for the urgencies are, and to look internal at what the change mechanisms are going to need to be to start on this journey.
And I think that also reinforces this idea that we're looking at really a broad system shift, right? In the analog economy, an annual strategy planning process was perfectly fine because the world was less dynamic and it didn't move as quickly. We knew who our competitors were. We would place 1 or 2 or 3 big bets a year after we did all of the hard analytical number cracking upfront, and we de-risk things upfront, right? In the digital economy, it's really the inverse. We have new competitors coming out all the time. They're coming from different domains. Maybe they're coming from technology leaders or startups. Investment flows are different, right? We have corporate venture capital and angel investors and VC investing at levels that we have never seen. And so we don't have just our core competitors anymore. We have hundreds, if not thousands, right, of companies that are going after bigger or littler bites of our value chain. It's a different thing that we have to be paying attention to. And so the strategic response of the companies that are getting this right are basically mimicking that market, right? Mm-hmm. And so we don't necessarily look to de-risk everything by a year-long analytical cycle. We actually have to get our hands dirty and start building and experimenting and shifting and pivoting and exiting and creating that more of a portfolio approach to experimentation and learning in order to see what works and see what's going to filter out in our markets. And the idea of cyber, for example, has been super helpful for a lot of organizations, but it's kind of an easier one to get our heads around, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's risk, and because there are specific tools that we have to look at, and because everybody in the organization knows that we need to do that. But as organizational dynamics go, it's a very powerful thing to associate digital with risk, because we have market risk now, right? We have competitive risk. And so as directors, if you're seeing some challenges anywhere in terms of how to have the right strategic conversation, I would just suggest that's one thing to consider, expanding the definition of risk. Cynthia, to your point about other reasons that this is challenging, Are there other things that come to mind in terms of capabilities or engagement or strategy models that you've seen that work or maybe don't work so well?
Yeah, I'd have to say this, Ryan. Yes, there are. Other reasons why this is hard. And I say this as a chief technology officer coming from the heart, but the old Clayton Christensen dilemma of sort of creative destruction and balancing, your core profitability and continuous business operations while you're creating a new future and new business models has always been difficult for companies. So it's a well-studied field, but it's always been difficult to redefine who you are and to be able to manage it. And it's been harder in COVID because you've got your nose to the ground trying to keep up continuous operations, and you want to default to say, this has worked for me before, let's just get the product out the door and try to figure out what happens tomorrow. So, again, I hope that there's a time for a breather here where you can step back and start thinking about how do you create, a new future based on the digital economy. You also have to be careful around Ryan's comments about cybersecurity, that it's not just the technology here. And I think if you put a lens on it and try to be talking about how do I use the tools, how do I use AI and machine learning and 5G and cloud computing and robotics and automation, you've absolutely got the wrong lens on the opportunities. This is really about growth, as we've said. So if there's one takeaway, I think, from what Ryan and I would emphasize, digital transformation is 100% about growth. And again, the automation side of it is productivity. It lays the groundwork for using the tools and getting the culture faster and more adept at working with data and connecting. But digital transformation is 100% around growth. And so again, don't always take the lens on just the technology and stop at cybersecurity. This is much more than that aspect of it. There's also, again, associated with creative destruction, capital allocation. How you manage capital and the demands on your capital as you try to start planning the new future and de-risk for it, to Ryan's point. So managing risk as you go forward has to be faster with experiments and a faster learning process. And that's not always the culture of many different companies. And then finally, it requires some pretty vast workplace changes in skill sets and rethinking those and how you bring that into the organization, whether it's mindset and culture or whether it's actually skills and capabilities, also has to be evaluated. So none of this is necessarily easy, but it does need to start with outside in. Classic market perspective. How can I provide more value to my customers? How do I recognize the changes in the environment that we're operating in and my customers are operating in?
So there's an organization named Klockner, which is in the steel industry. Some of you may have heard of it, which I think illustrates the journey that an organization can go on very, very well. Now, keep in mind, this was basically a middleman, right? They would buy supply from one side and then they would resell it with margin. So very sort of established industry, very established place in the value chain. And what they saw happening was that price transparency and supply chain automation and the rest was starting to move the power into different parts of the value chain, and they realized they were going to get in trouble if they didn't do something. So I like this example because it's a middleman, right? It's a commodity middleman, but they've been able to do something very, very powerful. They set themselves a 3-year strategy to become effectively the marketplace, the platform for the steel industry. How did they do that? Well, they first started to automate their processes, right? And build the efficiency that they can create. And then they externalized those into value propositions for customers, for partners. By the way, this is a very important strategic link. AWS and a lot of market leading capabilities have come out from exactly this kind of dynamic, right? We build something for ourselves and then we externalize it. But then they set some very specific KPIs. Year 1, they wanted to have 8% of their revenue digitally driven. Year 2, 20%, year 3, and so on and so on. And so the entire organization had this growth focus that Cynthia described, and they slowly built towards their new business model. Every investment that they made had to answer the question, how does this deepen our engagement with our customers, right? And so the combination of new revenue targets and an explicit requirement to engage with customers differently, and they've become the market leading platform in their sector after having been just a few years previous, again, a really traditional middleman. If they can do it, right, with that kind of very clear strategy and approach, success is available by asking the right kinds of questions. I would just say one other thing in terms of why this is hard. in many cases, when executive teams or boards are having conversations about digital and technology related topics, the conversation starts technology first, right? And we talk about blockchain nodes, and we talk about LoRaWAN networks, and we talk about all of these things. And if you don't know what that is, or if your colleagues don't know what that is, it's really easy to get lost very quickly. Most people are not engineers, and most people are not digital natives. And so again, part of the leadership capability these days is to demystify this stuff, right? Talk about customer engagement, talk about ecosystems, talk about value propositions, talk about competitive dynamics, and everybody can engage in those areas, because this is what we all do, right, as executives and as board directors. And you can start with something as easy as, well, what is digital, right? Because digital is a very simple idea. It's about adding data and connectivity to something. And so all of this change that we're talking about comes from that very atomic, very simple idea. And you can roll forward with that in terms of making the topic accessible and putting it into strategic terms. And so with that said, Cynthia, how are you seeing different implications for leadership? Who should be running the show, right? What is the right kind of leadership model that organizations should be looking at, and what should boards be asking of those leaders?
I think one of the most important things is that this is an enterprise activity. There will definitely be functional engagement, and there are going to be functional tools that will be adopted. But the idea that you're going to drive growth and have a growth strategy in a digital economy with digital tools supporting it, that falls to the CEO. And the board's role is to be challenging the CEO and the management team that they're thinking broadly enough about the opportunities, understanding enough the decision space. And so I think asking for data is really, really important. How do you know what the customers want? How are we testing that? How are we looking at our ecosystem of suppliers and thinking about opportunities in our value chain? Where does the data come from? Do we have sources of additional data? And not being flooded with data, but having it in a form that digital can provide to visualize and gain insights. So I think the boards can be challenging here and be asking a lot about where are the sources of the data from the CEO and the management team. So number one, keep the CEO on point. Number two, be challenging the management team about where they're getting the data so you can keep pressure testing the growth assumptions, the ecosystem assumptions. I think that's really profound in terms of the dialogue in the boardroom, and to bring in some questions about what that external environment, what those changes are, and really, really capture that, because the board is the one that can really open management's eyes to this and really get a new lens on what the drivers, the externalities are. I think it's important as board members that we're reading, we're studying not just our own industries, but really looking very broadly. And we serve that purpose in bringing that kind of insight back into the boardroom discussions.
So I completely agree that the CEO is ultimately the person, the individual responsible for driving this change and this transformational kind of approach. And it gets into a couple of things that Cynthia indicated earlier as well. If you ask, what is your digital strategy, right, to any number of people in an organization, depending on where they sit, you'll get a response that is about e-commerce, or you'll get a response that's about IT automation, or you'll get a response that's about marketing, social media, these sorts of things. So we have to be really careful with the terms that we use, because we might not all be on the same place. And this makes sense if you follow the sort of 25 years of evolution of the revolution, as I call it, in terms of how digital has progressed. It started with marketing, went into operations and automation. Right now it's in products and services. We have AI, we have VR, we have all of these things. And so understanding what we're really talking about is important. But when you're looking at the enterprise implications and business model implications that we're talking about here, there's only one person in the organization typically who can bring all of the functional leads together and the whole enterprise, right? And this gets into new incentives, driving more explicit collaboration across the enterprise teams, putting in place the new metrics and the new KPIs, and actually driving that through, right? It is perfectly fine, of course, to have a chief digital officer, for example, but they need to have the very clear sponsorship of the CEO and ideally of the board as well.
And Ryan, I would add, I think it's really important to have some eyes on culture and the management team and their capabilities, because I've been asked, how do you get more digital skills in the organization? And, the answer for me is not, well, we need people who understand the technology. Certainly there's a base there of that capability and understanding. And this is information technology, just like in my old role, I needed material scientist. But really, how do you become more digital is about agility and entrepreneurial mindset and speed of response and, a market orientation. And so in being fast paced. So it may mean bringing in board members or getting the executive and management teams very used to companies that are in fast cycle businesses. I work a lot with manufacturing industries, and, the cycle of change is very, very slow. When you come along and you say, we're going to have a new cell phone out every 12 months, that's a pace of change in product development and manufacturing response that, larger companies, different kind of asset bases really aren't used to. So I really do believe that driving agility and entrepreneurship through the culture and challenging the management team on how they're thinking externally and how quickly they can respond to change is really worth pressure testing.
I think that's absolutely the case. One way that I look at this sort of context, right? So if the broader macro changes, again, this shift from an analog economy and what worked there into this digital economy and the new models and the new approaches, that drives a new competitive set, which we're all working with and identifying and trying to compete with every day. In turn, that drives a new strategic requirement, including some of the speed and different investment strategies that Cynthia outlined. But then we also need to be leading differently as a result. So there's this real logic that sort of comes out of the scale of what's going on. What that means to me is that there are new leadership capabilities that are really important and powerful in our organizations. It's no longer necessarily the case that we know everything, right? Now, if we had spent in the analog economy, if we had spent 20 or 30 years in an industry, we kind of knew everything. We knew everybody, we knew the competition, we knew the products, we knew what worked. In the digital economy, it's just too fast, right? And so it's less about hierarchical command and control. It's less about thinking that as leaders, we have all of the answers. And it's much more about driving collaboration, bringing in diverse points of view from all different dimensions, right? It's much more about building, right? I mean, Cynthia mentioned that digital transformation is about growth. It's absolutely about growth. Part of growth is building new stuff, right? That can be building new businesses, new products and services, new divisions, that can be working with startups. But this idea of getting our hands dirty and building and understanding what that really means to do is a critical capability and skill that executives can bring in, because it's different than managing scale, right? It's a different experience, but if you can manage speed and scale and building things, you're really onto something. It's also about being empathetic with our colleagues in terms of, I don't understand this stuff, right? Everybody who talks to me about this talks to me about technology and I don't get it, right? And so let's hold people's hands as we cross the bridge and bring them into these conversations, demystify it, connect people across the organization. The cultural aspect is super, super important. And there are opportunities to engage everybody in this journey, right? What we see some organizations doing is innovation portals. What ideas do you have for the organization, right? What can we do differently? Reverse mentoring, of course, has been on the table for quite some time. But then there's also some things that are maybe less obvious. How do we flip our investment strategy so that we're seeding a broader portfolio of experiments instead of over anchoring in one or two things, right? So the culture change that goes along with this is both very important and very exciting when it works very well, but it is a journey to bring people along with.
Well, I think it becomes so much more important about metrics. Ryan, you brought that up earlier. We're so used to end metrics because we focused on what's, quantifiably measurable, and that's great. So we have EPS and we have revenue and return on invested capital and other financial metrics. But when you're in an environment like this, culture plays an important role in achieving milestones or having early indicators for success, and people who can make assessments in the organization to make that quick judgment. Is it working or isn't it? Again, that learning organization is really important that the board be looking for. How fast can we be making decisions? How do we know we're progressing in the right way? Because we're not going to end up wait for a new idea until we get to sales and realize too late that this is a failed idea. So, this fast experimentation requires a different set of eyes and processes. And so checking that you've got those process checks and have rethought them is really important in this environment.
And one way to instrument that is through more iterative investment cycles, right? And
Yes.
so rather than giving team X $2 million for 3 years and let's see how it comes out at the end, we give them 5 grand here, 15 grand there, and they manage to checkpoints, right? They manage to
Yes.
gates.
Exactly.
And when we can check, is it working? Do we need to pivot? Is it working so well we want to double down, right? And you'll have this very dynamic portfolio of pipeline of ideas, things that are being developed, taken to market, things that you exit, and all of that's really very good, even if it doesn't work, right? So one of the misconceptions that I see with many organizations is this idea of being okay to fail, right? Fast failure and all the rest. I think that works in very specific environments like Silicon Valley, right? Where we know that 90% of startups are going to fail. That's fine there. It doesn't necessarily work in traditional industries too well. If you ask your people how many of you are comfortable with failing, you're going to see hands down, right? If you ask your people how many of you are comfortable bringing learning into the organization, every hand will go up. You get to exactly the same result by placing that more positive spin on it, right? So if we experiment with something and it doesn't work, that's good. That means we've just saved months and millions of dollars or whatever it is by not going down a path that doesn't work. And so keep that sort of proactive, positive learning engagement in line as well. One other thing I'd say on learning is there are so many tools available right now that you can give to your people, give to your organizations in terms of getting some of these foundations and fundamental things right? And people come into our organizations with very different exposure to technology, but whether it's Udemy or Khan Academy or any of these things, for a very low amount of investment, you can start building up some fluency in these topics. And I would actually encourage you to look at this as part of your diversity strategies as well, right? Because if what we're saying is that digital is a critical driver of success, then we have an opportunity to be leveling the playing field with all of our people in terms of some of the foundational sorts of skills and knowledge.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit more, Ryan, about this human element of digital? We've talked about the top and about leadership, but again, the board will need to have, some eyes on the strategy that pulls the whole organization along, because there's no doubt as you become digital, your fundamental processes in your company may be required to change as we've been talking about, but the people and their empowerment, their engagement has to change as well. They're going to have some new skills, and being able to pull the organization along is really, really important. And again, this is why it goes up to the CEO. You've got to have alignment. You've got to have eyes from top to bottom, across the organization as well. But retraining people and getting the mindset to work in a digital environment is really, really, really critical. I really like the example. I was just exposed to it recently of Rolls-Royce engines. And they do a digital academy online, which is worth taking a look at as an example, but giving their people access to open tools that are available on the internet and just pointing them in a direction, say, you have some free time, take a look at what Google and Amazon and others are doing to get you to think about digital, but within the context of, I need a babysitter, how do I find one fast? I need some transportation, how do I find it fast? Making people comfortable with tools that empower them. And so they were focusing on not just senior leadership in that culture change, as we've talked about, but they're focusing all the way down through the organization. And I think there's a way also for boards to keep their eyes on that this has a people element to it. We're not going to succeed if you think you have to replace a lot of people and hire digital data scientists and the like. That is not the case. You're going to pull your organization along, and they're going to be part of this transformation.
The human element is critical, and it's regularly overlooked. Right, the culture change, understanding that this is scary for some people, right? Because again, you're talking to me in these digital technology terms, I don't understand the language, or I'm afraid of being automated out of my position or automated out of my job and being replaced. There's a lot of room for culture change, for skill and capability development, but also for empathy. Right, which again is a big role of the leaders, understanding that this is tricky and challenging for a number of people. Cynthia, one of the things I'd like to also explore is, okay, we have the foundations, we understand the definitions, we understand the urgency. What specific things can boards do to, in addition to looking at the measurements and some of the things that you mentioned previously, what other things can boards do, I should say, to make sure that they're really engaged?
I think we have existing mechanisms through the committee structure. And, I think asking, do we have the right focus in the committees and the right ownership? I've just been through that exercise with one board for, environmental, social governance issues and ESG separate committee. And Ryan, maybe you can say a few words about sort of the science and technology type of committee that you're on. But I also see in different formats where the committees, whether it's audit, taking a different view of the risk management process, really changes how they look at different levels of data, how they think about speed, how they reset the environment that they're going to be doing the audit over, this larger ecosystem that we've talked about, or the talent system to some of these issues, who is part of the HR, human resources, compensation committees, and do you have the right incentive for the behavior that you want? So really tearing apart what some of the key elements are, finding a home in existing committees is probably appropriate, as well as the strategy process and how boards can really prompt the strategy process to be more robust to, engage for this new future. But also forming a new committee. And then Ryan, I'd suggest you say a few words about, what happened in your experience.
Absolutely. So I think looking at the existing committee structures and your charters, right, can be a very powerful thing. How do we write a couple of new lines into the charters about digital KPIs, digital targets, digital capabilities, especially around the new growth that Cynthia introduced at the beginning of our call. What we've done at Nortech, and Jay Miller, our CEO, is actually on the call with us as well, is we created an entirely new committee called Science and Technology. So we based that on what companies like Intel and HP and other technology leaders were doing. But what it allowed us to do at the board level was to create a dedicated time to this conversation. And we look at internal operations, IT, cyber delivery and targets, but this is also really the holding place for a lot of innovation, new business model, new growth investment that's technology driven as well. And so there is, of course, the executive team that's running those, running that spend, running that exploration. But the full board has exposure to this in terms of what are we learning about our customers? What are we learning about our capabilities? To the point of culture, we're seeing a lot of cultural engagement around this as access and contribution starts to expand. And critically, we have a view on new growth opportunities, new revenue opportunities, and it has a specific place in the board meeting, in the discussions. This also, I think, is an opportunity to contribute to the annual strategy planning cycle, right? And so one thing that's very powerful for directors to do is start asking questions like, what are our new digitally driven value propositions? What do those look like? What are our targets? What are our incentives? And make sure that that is formally recognized, call it a growth call out, right? In the annual planning cycle. And then how are we tracking progress against that? What we've seen with a lot of corporate strategies, annual strategies, of course, is that it's business as usual, right? We operate at scale. We have a traditional sort of growth and expansion metric, but we're not explicitly calling out the new growth dimensions. And if we can't measure it, if we're not paying attention to it, it's really tricky to see how it's going to change the needle.
Yeah, I think a couple other things boards can do is ask for board education. Sometimes when you're kind of stuck, looking to, external guidance is not a bad idea. And really prompting where you get inputs to train the board and the management team, and asking for that very explicitly is really important. I've got another example where one of the boards that I'm on was very prescient, and the CEO and the board chair have given a real focus on what they call enablers in the organization. And so the board, at every board meeting, we get an update on how the enablers are going. One of them is digitization, and I won't again use this word digital strategy, but it's combined with marketing, it's combined with sustainability, it's combined with talent, and it's combined with strategy. And so the board has this discussion of these are our enabling skills that we need. How do they intersect and come together that we're creating value? And again, that focus on value and what you can do. But it's important, again, that the whole board has visibility to it, whether in Ryan's example, it's like a committee that will be handling that and can manage some deeper dives. The board broadens its education, but the board has regular visibility to these issues.
There's some other frameworks that you can consider working into the annual strategy conversations as well. what we see a lot of organizations doing is expanding their engagement with the broader ecosystem, right? And so there's really four or five domains that you can ask questions for. You know, would it make sense for us to be making some investments, right? In terms of corporate venture capital, how do we get a seat at the table with the cutting edge stuff? And that delivers learning, that delivers potentially acquisition opportunities, partnership opportunities, new capabilities for ourselves. So that's one. Building out new products and services that are digitally driven, close to core, right? What are our targets there? Ecosystem partnerships. So when we think about our customers, what are they really trying to achieve, right? And who can we work with to make it easier for them to have those outcomes that they're looking for? Very powerful conversations around ecosystem and partnerships and those sorts of go-to-market. And so identify the specific things that you want to see in your strategy and make that basically a part of the annual planning discussion. Cynthia, one of the things that we talked about was this idea of a digital director, right? And we've seen this in a number of organizations, but I found that part of our planning conversation to be very insightful. So would welcome your thoughts on specific board composition opportunities and risks there as well.
Well, as Ryan and I have talked about, having a board, I think that's more broadly knowledgeable in how digital tools can impact the organization is helpful. And that's part of, I think, the board education. But I'm not necessarily, saying go out and hire someone who's really a data scientist or comes from an IT kind of based industry. I think it's equally important to get board directors who are used to transformation in very fast cycle type of industries, who are very entrepreneurial, who are creative builders, as we've said, and can really help the company think differently about its ecosystem and its growth opportunities. And I really think that is quite important for that speed in that outside environment, to really get that broader view and bring that into the board. So NomGov can be really doing maybe the nomination and governance committee of the boards can really be thinking about that. What skills do we need to bring into the board, and getting some diversity, because diversity also helps open your eyes to what those possibilities are. Diversity from different industries. If you're functioning in automotive and all you're listening to is automotive, you may be missing sideways, what's happening in other parts of your value chain, what's happening in other industries. And so this diversity at the board, I think it is really taking on some extra depth and meaning for how you can manage a digital transformation.
There is a risk here, right? If you sort of go down too focused of a route. Which is the counterpoint to what Cynthia just said. What we've seen with a number of boards is they bring on a digital director who has a very specific domain or functional context for their digital knowledge, right? And so maybe they were really great at e-commerce or really great at IT automation or something like this, but they're not necessarily trilingual, right? What we need on our boards are people who understand strategy, growth, and technology, right? And by the way, who can contribute to the board culture, who have some capabilities in terms of understanding the industry and the customer base and the rest of it. But if you have someone who's very functionally deep or sort of more exclusively technology, more of a technology leader, you risk putting them into a position of tremendous power and authority to take you down a very automation sort of functionally specific path, right? And so all of the things that we know makes a good board director still apply here. It's again just this sort of additional kind of experience and capability that we're looking at. But I think again, the best digital leaders are trilingual: strategy, technology, and with the growth focus.
I agree with you completely. And I've sort of lived that world as a CTO. And it's one thing to know the technology, but your greatest assets you bring are strategic thinking and a growth orientation. Your best partners are the business leaders, your marketing, colleagues who are going to help you drive growth. And all those do need to come together. So the idea that a CDO is going to solve your problems and you're going to devolve to that person, I've seen companies, and maybe many of you have, where you're trying to bring in the technology skill set, but you've got someone who's finding a really hard time to understand your business operations. And again, you're going to need to meld that together through training programs or whatever, fast onboarding processes, but you're going to need to think about getting all three of those.
Okay, we are at the end of our time for the fireside chat. So I'll just ask Cynthia for a closing comment, then I'll make one, and then we can open it up to questions in advance of going into the breakout room. So Cynthia, over to you.
I'm not going to be too long because, as Ryan and I have found in previous conversations, we could talk a long, long time on this topic. So it's been really enjoyable. But again, I'd like to highlight there's a lot of urgency because of the environment change. You know, the variability you have, you know, the speed at which change can happen, I think has been highlighted in COVID, and it's not going away. This has been there underlying. But it's representing a new way of working that all businesses will need to respond. And the point that I think we've tried to drive home from the start is that this is all about growth. There's no doubt that the automation part of the digital opportunity could be productivity, and it sets the basis for some bigger things. But this is all about growth, not as a separate strategy, but as part of a growth strategy. So thank you for joining us.
My final comment is that digital transformation is not a technology issue. The technology is relatively easy, accessible, and straightforward these days. This is about new business models, new leadership capabilities, and driving speed and scale. That's what wins. We have all of the data in the world that shows that that's what wins. So thank you very much, everyone, for staying with us. And thank you very much, Cynthia. I've enjoyed both our conversation today and all of our planning conversations.
Likewise.
And yeah, we'd love to open it up for questions and comments from everyone in the event.
May I ask a question?
Please.
When you mentioned that, you know, the pitfall having a specific skill, such as the digital officer on your board,
Yeah.
I found that in my previous board, that seems to be the excuse for not getting people with specific skills on the board, you know, for everything. I mean, this particular board is like, oh, we don't want a lawyer because then we will defer to the lawyer for everything. You know, we don't want, I mean, when you say the digital, that just fall right into that.
Yeah. And I'll take the first shot at it because I think I'm the one that made the comment. My point is that having a deep functional expertise is not enough, right? If you have it, it's terrific, but it has to be balanced with the ability to understand and contribute to strategy and some of the governance topics. And so it was only that point, because we've seen it before, right? Where you bring in someone who's super, super deep, but has never run a P&L or doesn't understand board culture, doesn't understand, you know, some of the core requirements of governance. So it was more just a comment on balance as opposed to excluding anybody.
Yeah, agree. I don't think anyone should pass getting on a board if they're going to be bringing in functional expertise. So, you know, the higher level thinking, the strategic mindset is absolutely necessary.
Thank you very much. I was
Thank you,
nominated and I had a hard time convincing this board to get some skilled people on the board.
Keep trying.
Yes, please. I'm Carol.
Hi, first of all, you were both excellent because I've spent the last nearly 20 years in a highly technology environment. I was at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, total fish out of water because I'm a business person. They gave me no respect whatsoever, but it was interesting to learn, and I can understand, and I agree with you, Ryan. It, you know, you can read about the technology, but if you don't understand what you're trying to do with your business and your strategy, you could ruin the business. You could totally put, you know, someone out of business coming on the board and trying to go into one area. But my question, and you all did some of this, is the importance of the questions that board directors put forth. I mean, I was taking notes that a question, whatever technology, what is your strategy with growth on this? What types of things that, you know, what's this going to do to our profit and loss? What's, you know, how much money is going to have to go into this? Any kinds of questions that that you have in addition to the ones that you've given would be very helpful. And thank you again.
Sure, Cynthia.
Oh, I want, what comes to mind is giving the example of John Deere. and I've talked to the consultants who started them on their journey 15 or so years ago to become more a provider of digitized equipment. And asking what's the job we're trying to do and what's the value we're providing to our customers. And I think having an open lens on that is really important, because the aha moment for John Deere was, we work the land, we provide this heavy industrial equipment and it works the land. And so we dig up the ground and, we work in the fields. But the aha moment was we really manage the work at the job site. And that required something completely different than just a heavy duty piece of equipment. It required, logistics planning and tracking and data management in a way that they hadn't conceived of before. So, when you're drilling down, and Ryan and I have brought this up numerous times, where's the value we're actually providing to customers? How is the customer's job changing? I think is a really important line that a lot of companies don't see, that something has changed here. And, drilling down along where that value proposition is at and how you think differently, I think is one of the most fundamental things that a board can ask. And how you get the data, how you get it fast enough. Are you getting the data that you need to make decisions? Because, you want to make sure that you're managing risk and you're making decisions as well-founded as possible. And so there's a lot more sources for data that's a lot faster in providing information about your markets, potential competitors, et cetera. And it may not be the traditional sources that you've looked at. So I would suggest two of those, again, both around ecosystem and value proposition.
And I'll just contribute to the John Deere example as well, because they have some fascinating KPIs from this farming as a service, right, business model that they have. So one specific example, they have reduced herbicide dispersal and associated spend by 90% because they're using AI-powered computer vision, and they only apply the herbicide to the specific, it's a surgical strike, right, just at the weed, not across the entire field, right? And so that's a very specific KPI and metric that obviously saves a lot of money. And then there's ancillary benefits, herbicides not getting into the food supply and all the rest as well. But if you actually are following what's happening with Deere, they're running into some problems with the business model because they're no longer able to, or users and local communities are no longer able to do as much of the maintenance. And so if these high-tech machines break down, they're broken down, right? Until you have a very advanced kind of operations and maintenance capability coming in. And so that is not what that's not what farmers want. Right? They want to maximize field productivity. They actually don't want to buy anything from Deere. If they don't have to, if they didn't have to, they wouldn't. Right. And so when we're thinking about Deere, when we're thinking about anybody, what is the outcome that the end customer wants? Then how do we work with an ecosystem? In this case, it could be maintenance providers and the rest, right? To make sure that that end outcome is being delivered. So I saw a couple of hands come up. I saw George and John.
We're going to run out of time to move to the breakout. So you want to take those two questions, or do you want to defer those to breakout?
Well, I'd say, John, we have 1 minute for George, and then we can move on if that's okay.
Okay.
Sure. Thank you. So interesting. Those of you who are in the Twin Cities today probably read the Star Trib article about Communication Systems, a public company that is completely shifting and pivoting. They were in the business of selling connectivity products for the broadband networks. And now they're in the process of buying a company called Pineapple Energy. And they're going to be in the business of selling home solar energy related systems. So, complete pivot. About the only thing that's common is a focus on technology. My question to the group, if folks have been involved in similar kinds of fundamental 180-degree pivots, how have what examples have you seen, and how have those gone for you, and what are lessons that others can take away from that as they think either about this particular situation or other similar situations in their companies? Wide ranging question, I know.
That's a big one.
Cynthia, you go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Ryan. I have to honestly say I haven't, personally experienced a 180-degree pivot. I have, and I'd almost promote this, not thinking of the whole, I'm changing my entire business, because, Deere still sells equipment, and this is a viable example, but, what they missed was, in the value chain, the servicing of the parts and the whole customer experience about what that would require when they made the ship. So I think that the rigor of what the change involves, that change transformation process has to be pretty rigorous around the whole value chain, with a focus on, are the customers going to be happy with this, and is it going to be a win-win for us and for them? I've been involved where there have been new business units set up, taking, for one example, an old ink company that recognized that their presence on printing lines for all sorts of publication and printed materials really gave them a capability of managing design and color, not just delivering this physical product. And they ended up transforming that into an entirely new business for servicing and working with designers of printed materials, and bringing their technology of color and design attributes up front into a design process, and hitting a part of the value chain that they'd been serving only indirectly, and really taking a place right there with selling a service instead. And that's challenging, because you went from a physical product in a company that was only used to selling very low margin physical products, and say, now you're going to have a very high value service, and it's going to be delivered over the cloud. We really had to set up a whole set of different people who could sell differently. We had to set up customer relationships that were quite different, because it was really a new customer base. And so again, thinking through that whole value chain and what you're now delivering, and how you have to make sure you address potential gaps that could arise as you transition, I think is really important in both of these examples.
I'll give a 5-second comment, and then we need to move into breakout groups, which is, look at what the big digital platform companies are doing in financial services, right? There's no difference between data and money. There's no difference between data and health. And if you have those kinds of really powerful capabilities, you can translate them into other industries. And that's really going to be part of the driver for the shift that George described. Okay, we are at the end of our fireside chat. And thank you very much for the questions and participation. John, I'll hand over to you.
Yep. Everybody can provide a virtual applause to our panelists. And we're ready to move to breakout to talk. And who's in charge of getting us into the breakout? Here we go.
Are we done?
I think they're just.
Can you all hear me? Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoy our discussion. I sure did. I've learned so much. As John mentioned in his introductory remarks, we appreciate your feedback by completing the survey that's going to be dropped in the chat. So please let us know your thoughts, and always, we want to always be improving. So if you have any thoughts on that, let us know. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.